San Francisco's tsunami sirens began wailing at 4:15 a.m., but by then, the wave was already visible on the horizon, a wall of water 400 feet high, racing at 500 miles per hour. I'm Dr. Michael Chun, speaking from one of the few elevated facilities still above water as the ocean reclaims every coastal city on the planet. For 2 decades, I've studied earthquake patterns along the Pacific Ring of Fire. I'm broadcasting now from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's emergency site, 1,500 feet up in the Berkeley Hills, one of the few places in the Bay Area that remains above the rising waterline. Everything I'm about to describe defies 70 years of seismic science and represents the most catastrophic natural disaster in human history. But the data doesn't lie, even when it shows the impossible. It began with what our instruments first registered as a magnitude 9.2 earthquake centered roughly 200 miles west of Tokyo along the Japan Trench, where the Pacific Plate subducts beneath the Philippine Sea Plate. That alone would have made it one of the strongest earthquakes in recorded history, comparable to the 2011 Tohoku event that triggered the Fukushima disaster. But within 90 seconds, something unprecedented appeared in the data. The earthquake wasn't stopping. Normally, even the largest quakes release their energy within seconds, perhaps 2 minutes at most. Seismic waves radiate outward, the fault slips, and the event ends once the accumulated stress is released. This time, it continued. 17 full minutes of violent rupture, propagating along the Japan Trench at speeds nearly 10 times faster than any known fault movement. Seismic readings indicated that the rupture extended the entire length of the trench. At the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii, data began streaming in from Japanese seismic stations, readings so extreme that many assumed equipment malfunction. Instruments were showing ground displacement measured in meters, not centimeters. Vertical motion suggested that sections of the seafloor were collapsing, not merely shifting. Over 1,000 kilometers of the ocean floor appeared to be dropping dramatically. Emergency protocols were triggered across Japan and the Pacific Rim, but the scale of seafloor displacement suggested this was far beyond a standard tsunami event. The Japanese Meteorological Agency issued its tsunami alert just 4 minutes after the quake began, but by the time the warning was broadcast, it was already obsolete. Computers modeling the wave's travel time and height returned impossible numbers, waves exceeding 100 meters tall, reaching Japan's coastal cities in less than 15 minutes. Operators believed the software had crashed. Such data defied geologic logic. The city of Sai, rebuilt after the 2011 tsunami with reinforced seawalls and upgraded evacuation systems, received the warning with what was believed to be a 15-minute window. The wave arrived in 8. It moved faster than any model predicted, accelerated by the immense gravitational potential of the displaced water mass. Security footage later recovered from elevated cameras shows the moment it appeared. A dark line across the horizon, growing taller by the second. Calling it a wave doesn't do it justice. It was a vertical wall of water stretching beyond the camera's frame, rising 120 meters above sea level and roaring forward with the sound of thunder as billions of tons of water compressed the air ahead. When it struck Sai, the city's 15-meter seawalls vanished in seconds, obliterated under unimaginable pressure. The wave didn't break, it advanced inland as a single towering face of water, carrying debris, vehicles, and entire buildings with it. Reinforced concrete structures designed to withstand any known tsunami or quake were pulverized. The wave surged nearly 20 miles inland before losing momentum, leaving behind bare bedrock and thick layers of mud and wreckage. Tokyo, protected by the Boso Peninsula, should have been partially shielded, but the seafloor collapse displaced such massive volumes of water that the waves overtopped the peninsula and entered Tokyo Bay from multiple directions. The city's low-lying districts, home to millions, were defenseless. Tsunami sirens sounded across Tokyo just minutes before impact. The first wave entered the bay at nearly 90 meters high, recorded by the last functioning tide gauge before it was destroyed. In shallow waters, the wave rose even higher, over 100 meters before crashing into the waterfront. Within 20 minutes, much of Tokyo's industrial and financial heart was submerged. But it wasn't a single strike. The collapse generated multiple waves, arriving roughly every half hour. Each one was larger, heavier, filled with the wreckage of the cities before it. The third wave, nearly an hour after the first, was the largest of all. As Japan was being consumed, seismic stations around the world began detecting something even more alarming. The rupture wasn't confined to Japan. It was spreading south along the Philippine Trench, then leaping to the Mariana Trench, extending across nearly 5,000 kilometers. It was as though the entire western Pacific seafloor had given way. Data revealed a terrifying truth. The Pacific Plate wasn't just sliding, it was collapsing vertically, dropping into the Earth's mantle. A geological process known as slab detachment, something that normally takes millions of years, was happening in real time. This vertical drop displaced an incomprehensible volume of water. To compare, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which killed over 200,000 people, came from a seafloor displacement of roughly 30 cubic kilometers. This event displaced nearly 5,000 cubic kilometers. The entire Pacific Ocean had been set in motion. By 4:15 a.m. Pacific time, the tsunami warning systems along North America's west coast were registering data that made my blood run cold. Models showed waves between 200 and 400 meters high, racing toward California. At those heights, the waves wouldn't just flood the coast, they would overtop entire coastal mountain ranges and sweep dozens of miles inland. I relayed the data to emergency management officials, convincing them that a wave taller than the Empire State Building was heading for California took proof that few wanted to believe. San Francisco's alert system finally activated, giving residents roughly 6 hours to evacuate to elevations above 500 meters. But San Francisco's highest points barely reached 300 meters. Surrounded by water on 3 sides, there was nowhere truly safe. The order went out anyway, an evacuation larger and more desperate than any in American history. Millions fled eastward, climbing into the hills and valleys of the Bay Area, searching for safety as the Pacific advanced. And as I watched the data streaming in from around the world, one truth became inescapable. This was no ordinary earthquake, no isolated disaster. It was the Earth itself, shifting on a scale humanity was never meant to witness. Highways leading east from San Francisco, stretching across the Bay Bridge and through Oakland toward the hills, were instantly gridlocked as millions of vehicles tried to escape using roads built for nothing more than routine rush hour traffic. Interstate 80, the main evacuation route, transformed into a 50-mile-long parking lot as cars filled every lane. When the traffic stopped completely, many people abandoned their vehicles and began walking inland in desperate attempts to reach safety on foot. Los Angeles faced even greater chaos. The city's geography and population density made evacuation nearly impossible. Over 15 million residents were trapped in a basin surrounded by mountains, with only a few major highways, I-10, I-15, and I-5 leading inland. Within minutes, those routes were overwhelmed far beyond capacity. The traffic multiplied tenfold. Predictions showed that even elevations above 1,000 meters might not guarantee safety if the largest wave struck at high tide. forcing people to travel more than 50 miles inland just to survive. San Diego began evacuating as soon as the alerts were issued, but its coastal position and limited inland routes created bottlenecks that immobilized hundreds of thousands of residents. Military installations like Naval Base San Diego and Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton launched their own evacuation procedures, but the movement of thousands of personnel and vehicles only deepened the civilian gridlock. Seattle's situation was uniquely perilous. Much of the city stood on reclaimed land that would liquefy during the earthquake preceding the tsunami. For years, evacuation plans had assumed that tall structures like the Space Needle could serve as safe vertical refuges.
But when projections showed waves exceeding 300 meters, it became clear that no building in the city could offer protection. Along the entire West Coast, millions struggled to flee within a few short hours, trapped by infrastructure built for normal traffic, not mass exodus. The math was merciless. There were far more people than the roads could carry in the time available. No matter how efficiently the evacuations were managed, millions would still be caught in coastal zones when the waves arrived. As the Pacific coast braced for impact, seismic stations began issuing warnings across the Atlantic. The seafloor collapse was not confined to the Pacific. Instruments detected similar ruptures along the Puerto Rico Trench and the Java Trench, suggesting that whatever force had torn the Pacific plate loose was also destabilizing other tectonic boundaries. The mechanism was uncertain, but the outcome was undeniable. Enormous tsunamis were forming in all three major oceans, set to strike coastlines around the world within hours. New York City received its warning early that morning, with less than 7 hours to move a population of 20 million people away from islands and low-lying coastal zones. The George Washington Bridge, the city's vital link to the mainland, became impassable within half an hour. Miami's plight was even more desperate. Built barely 10 meters above sea level and surrounded by flat terrain, the city offered no natural refuge. Waves could travel dozens of miles inland. Interstate 95, the only major escape route, turned into a stationary river of cars stretching from Miami to West Palm Beach. Across the Atlantic, European cities began receiving their own alerts. London, protected by the Thames Barrier and situated upriver, initially seemed safe until models showed that a 200-meter wave would overtop the defenses and flood the city center to depths of 50 meters. The evacuation of 9 million residents toward higher ground became one of the largest population movements in European history. As dawn broke over the Pacific, satellites captured haunting images of the ocean surface. From space, the tsunami appeared as vast white lines radiating outward from multiple epicenters, ripples that might have been beautiful were they not the signatures of devastation. These were not gentle waves. They carried more energy than any weapon humankind had ever created. Across the world, billions of people were either fleeing or bracing for impact where escape was impossible. The first wave to reach California rose silently from the horizon, 8 minutes later than predicted, though that detail meant nothing to the millions still trapped in unmoving traffic. I watched it unfold from our facility in the Berkeley Hills, binoculars fixed on San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. There was no telltale recession of water, no sudden exposure of the sea floor. Instead, the horizon darkened as an immense wall of water blotted out the sunlight. Then came the sound, a low, growing rumble that deepened until it became a deafening roar, swallowing every other noise, even the cries of those who realized what was coming. The wave struck the Farallon Islands first, 30 miles offshore, and wiped them from existence. The wildlife refuge vanished beneath water measured at 380 meters high. The lighthouse disappeared in an instant, and when the water receded, the islands were stripped bare, rock scored clean of soil and vegetation. Through the binoculars, I watched as the wave advanced toward the Golden Gate Bridge. Its towers rose over 700 feet above the water, and for a brief, foolish moment, I thought the bridge might survive. But when the wave struck, still over 350 meters high, it hit the south tower like a moving mountain. The structure disintegrated in seconds. The steel cable snapped, the towers shattered, and the bridge vanished entirely in less than 15 seconds. In its place was only a raging torrent of brown water filled with twisted debris. The surge crossed San Francisco Bay, its height diminished to about 200 meters, but still powerful enough to obliterate everything on the eastern shore. Oakland, Berkeley, and the entire East Bay were struck by a rolling slurry of concrete, steel, vehicles, and bodies. The sheer impact shook our facility, despite being 1,500 feet above sea level. Instruments registered ground motion equivalent to a magnitude 6 earthquake, not from tectonic activity, but from billions of tons of water colliding with the land. Windows cracked, shelves toppled, and the hillside itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the ocean's fury. And while San Francisco vanished beneath the first wave, Los Angeles waited helplessly for the next. Windows in our building cracked under the pressure wave that came before the water. Loose objects tumbled from shelves as the entire hillside trembled beneath the force of what was approaching. Then the second wave struck Los Angeles, and if the destruction in San Francisco had been unimaginable, what happened here was worse. The city's vast sprawl meant that far more people were caught in the inundation zone when the water arrived. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, responsible for handling nearly half of all cargo entering the United States, were obliterated. The wave hit with a violence that defied comprehension. Shipping containers weighing 30 tons were tossed through the air as easily as cardboard in a storm. The coastal icons of Southern California, Santa Monica, Venice Beach, Manhattan Beach, were erased in moments. A 400-meter wall of water rose over the coastline, surged over the hills, and rolled unbroken toward downtown Los Angeles. As the wave moved inland, its height diminished, but it was still over 100 meters high when it reached the heart of the city, 15 miles from the ocean. Skyscrapers 30 stories tall disappeared beneath the surface. The Hollywood Hills provided only partial refuge. The water curved around them, funneling into valleys and canyons that became deep, still basins. Beverly Hills, caught in one of those valleys, became a temporary inland sea more than 200 feet deep. Mansions that had once stood as symbols of wealth and permanence were crushed or torn free from their foundations, drifting like wreckage through drowned neighborhoods. Farther south, San Diego suffered even greater devastation. Its location along the deep southern coast exposed it to waves that had preserved their full strength as they traveled through open water. The wave that struck San Diego reached 420 meters, the tallest ever recorded by any instrument before those instruments themselves were destroyed. The city's highest elevations, thought to be safe, were inundated as the wave funneled inland and rose to heights exceeding 1,300 feet. Naval Base San Diego, home to much of the Pacific Fleet, was annihilated. The water struck with enough force to lift warships and carriers into the air. The USS Carl Vinson, a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered aircraft carrier,
was hurled 3 miles inland and came to rest upright amid the ruins of downtown, its flight deck aligned with the shattered upper floors of office towers. Seattle's catastrophe was compounded by what had already occurred beneath the surface. The earthquake before the tsunami had liquefied the ground, turning much of the city into shifting sludge. Structures that might have survived the flood collapsed or leaned at grotesque angles. The Space Needle, the city's proudest landmark, took the full brunt of a wave that reached its observation deck. Somehow it remained standing, but its base was buried in a slurry of debris, its slender column rising from an ocean that now covered Seattle.
Even cities thought to be far enough inland were not spared. Portland, Oregon, 70 miles from the coast, was struck. When the tsunami traveled up the Columbia River, its deep channel guiding the wave inland without losing power. Though the wave's height diminished to roughly 150 meters, it still flooded downtown and surged into residential neighborhoods along the Willamette River, places that had never imagined the sea could reach them. Vancouver, British Columbia, suffered a similar fate. The tsunami traveled up the Fraser River, inundating the city's harbor and downtown core. Water depths exceeded 200 feet, and the geography of the region caused waves to wrap around Vancouver Island, colliding from multiple directions. The interference between those waves created towering peaks of water that destroyed entire districts in seconds. While the Pacific coast was being consumed, the Atlantic coast waited in dread. The waves crossing that ocean were born from a different seafloor collapse, shaped by another geometry, one that made them even more unpredictable and deadly. New York City's evacuation had moved millions out of Lower Manhattan and coastal boroughs, yet millions more remained in harm's way. The city's geography worked against it. Manhattan's bridges and tunnels became choke points, trapping evacuees as the water approached. Miami faced an even crueler reality. The entire southern half of Florida lay within the inundation zone, and the state's flat terrain offered no refuge. Despite 7 hours of evacuation efforts, only a fraction of the population had reached safety. Interstate 95, the lifeline north, was immobilized for hundreds of miles. Abandoned cars lined the highway as people took to foot, hoping to outrun what could not be outrun. Farther north, Washington, D.C. debated whether to evacuate. Built along the Potomac River and shielded from the direct coast, the city seemed safe, until models showed that tsunami waves could travel through the Chesapeake Bay and surge upriver. Key government officials had already been moved to underground facilities, but the public was left uncertain, torn between orders to flee and instructions to stay. Boston faced its own nightmare. The city's low-lying waterfront, centuries-old streets, and limited highway network made mass evacuation almost impossible. Its intricate harbor and scattered islands created interference zones that amplified some waves unpredictably, making it impossible to know which neighborhoods would be hit hardest until it was too late. Across the Atlantic, European cities were facing their own unfolding disaster. In London, confusion reigned. Many trusted the Thames Barrier, believing it would protect the city. Engineers warned that it had never been designed for tsunamis. The gates, rising barely 65 feet, would be meaningless against a wave hundreds of meters tall. In the Netherlands, Amsterdam and the low-lying provinces stood on borrowed time. Much of the nation existed below sea level, dependent on a network of dikes and pumps that required power to function. When the waves destroyed coastal infrastructure, the pumps failed, and the water began to claim the land even after the first surge had passed. Throughout the Mediterranean,
Coastal nations braced for smaller but still catastrophic waves. The enclosed sea funneled and reflected the energy, amplifying it in unpredictable ways. Barcelona, Marseille, Naples, and countless smaller coastal towns began mass evacuations that tested every road and highway as tens of millions sought safety where there was none. Off the American coast, satellites captured the approach of the first Atlantic wave as it neared the outer banks of North Carolina. The barrier islands that once protected the mainland vanished beneath the sea in moments. Towns like Negs Head and Kitty Hawk, places that had witnessed humanity's first flight, were swallowed without a trace. The surge swept across the shallow sounds behind the islands, transforming them into a single inland sea hundreds of feet deep. Norfolk, Virginia, home to the largest naval base in the world, was struck next. The wave entered the Chesapeake Bay and reflected off its narrow confines, hitting from multiple directions at once. Ships were torn from their moorings, crashing into one another as if they were toys. Aircraft carriers collided and capsized amid the flood, vanishing beneath the surface as water filled every dock and structure. Then the Potomac began to rise. Water surged upriver, faster than anyone believed possible, announcing that Washington, D.C. had run out of time.
Shanghai met a similar fate. The tsunami moved up the Yangtze River, attacking from the east, while another surge pushed inland. Evacuation efforts had been underway for hours, but with 27 million residents, there was no way to move everyone in time. The waves reached 310 meters high, sweeping 25 miles inland. Downtown Shanghai disappeared beneath 700 feet of swirling debris-filled water. Tokyo, already destroyed by the first quake-driven tsunami, was struck again. Secondary waves arrived from multiple directions, smaller but just as deadly. They crashed into a city already broken, toppling rescue centers, drowning survivors, and turning devastation into annihilation. Thousands of emergency workers were lost, and the death toll soared from hundreds of thousands to millions in hours. Farther south, the waves that crossed the Pacific reached Australia. Sydney was engulfed by a 280-meter wall of water that submerged the Opera House, the harbor bridge, and everything within 10 miles of the coast. The flood surged inland along the Parramatta River, drowning suburbs that had never imagined they could be touched by the sea. In Brisbane, the river's narrow channel compressed the incoming water, amplifying it. By the time the wave reached downtown, it was even higher than at the coast, 350 feet deep, carrying the wreckage of the suburbs it had already destroyed. In India, the seafloor collapse along the Java and Sunda trenches created waves that converged on the subcontinent from both the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. Mumbai, built across 7 islands and home to 20 million residents, was hit from 3 sides. The gateway of India vanished under 600 feet of water as the waves advanced until they reached the Western Ghats 40 miles inland.
Secondary waves, reflected off continental shelves and underwater ridges, began crisscrossing the oceans. Some collided and amplified each other, creating waves even larger than the first. The planet's oceans had become a chaotic machine of destruction, pulsing with energy that would take days to dissipate as the seafloor settled into its new shape. The immediate devastation from the water was beyond comprehension, but what came next was just as deadly. Civilization itself began to unravel as interconnected systems failed one after another. Power grids, supply chains, and communication networks, all of it had been built under the assumption that humanity's infrastructure would remain intact. Now those assumptions were gone. Nuclear power plants along nearly every coast failed catastrophically. Designed for tsunamis a fraction of the size, they had no defense against walls of water hundreds of meters high. Cooling systems were obliterated, and reactor cores began to overheat within hours. In Japan, the strengthened facilities built after Fukushima were overwhelmed tenfold. The Fukushima Daiichi plant, already infamous for one disaster, was struck again. Its remaining containment structures ripped apart and its reactors left exposed to the open ocean. Across Japan, 17 nuclear facilities lost cooling simultaneously, triggering multiple meltdowns and spreading radiation over an already drowned nation. In California, the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, constructed on cliffs 85 feet above the sea, was swallowed by a 400-meter wave. The reactors themselves were torn from their foundations and carried inland, where they continued to leak radiation into groundwater feeding the Central Valley, poisoning the agricultural heart of the United States. Few survivors remained nearby, but the contamination rendered thousands of square miles uninhabitable. In Europe, the story was the same. Coastal reactors in France were destroyed, and the enclosed Mediterranean trapped radioactive material, spreading contamination throughout the sea. Even the inland Tristan nuclear plant, drawing its cooling water from the Rhone River, was struck by waves funneled up the channel. 3 of its 4 reactors went into full meltdown, releasing radiation across southern France and into northern Italy. The chemical and industrial devastation was just as severe. Oil refineries, chemical plants, and storage facilities worldwide were obliterated, their contents spilling into floodwaters already thick with debris, sewage, and bodies. In the United States, the Houston Ship Channel, home to the largest concentration of petrochemical industries in the country, was swallowed by the Gulf Tsunami. Hundreds of tanks burst open, releasing crude oil, gasoline, and toxins into the water, contaminating inland aquifers and poisoning millions who had fled the coast. In Europe, the port of Rotterdam was obliterated. Massive chemical storage facilities were swept inland, scattering industrial waste across the Netherlands. Toxic mixtures of salt water and chemicals soaked farmland, killing vegetation and ruining soil that had once fed a continent. Disease soon followed. Within days, outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread through overcrowded refugee camps. The dead could not be buried fast enough, and decaying bodies poisoned what little clean water remained. Hospitals and clinics had been wiped out, and the few surviving medical workers were overwhelmed or displaced themselves. Food shortages began within a week. Global supply chains collapsed completely. The ports that had once moved the world's grain, rice, and produce were gone, their warehouses underwater. Farmlands near the coast were rendered infertile by salt, and inland production couldn't meet the demand. Nations that had been exporters only days before were suddenly starving. The economic collapse was absolute. The world's major financial centers, New York, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, no longer existed. With their destruction, global markets vanished. The digital records that defined ownership, currency, and trade were lost forever, buried beneath oceans and debris. Trillions in wealth disappeared overnight, erased because the systems that recorded it had ceased to exist. Insurance and finance imploded. No company, no government could absorb the loss of half the world's property and population. The insurance industry ceased to function entirely, and with it, the very mechanisms that modern economies relied on to rebuild. Humanity's survivors fled inland, in numbers never before seen. In North America, 200 million people were displaced.
pouring into regions utterly unprepared to sustain them. Cities far from the coast tripled or quadrupled in size overnight, overwhelming infrastructure, draining clean water reserves, and collapsing supply systems. The U.S. government, relocated to Denver after Washington's destruction, struggled to reestablish authority. Communication was fragmented, command chains had been obliterated, many officials were dead, and those who survived were scattered across the country, cut off from one another. The same story repeated around the world. China had lost its industrial coast and nearly 400 million citizens. India was drowning in the aftermath of Mumbai and Chennai's annihilation. Europe was crippled by the loss of London and countless coastal capitals. The world had entered an age of silence. Its great cities gone, its networks severed, and its survivors left to face a planet that had turned against them. Amsterdam and much of Europe's Mediterranean coast were gone. No nation had the strength or resources to aid another when every society on Earth was fighting for its own survival. Power grids that had endured the first disaster were now failing under the strain of inland cities overwhelmed by refugees. Most energy production had relied on coastal plants that drew cooling water from the sea, and when those vanished, the surviving inland stations couldn't meet the sudden surge in demand. Rolling blackout soon became permanent darkness as systems overloaded and shut down. Communication was collapsing. Cell towers went silent as power failed, and satellites began to decay without ground control. The undersea cables that had once carried the world's internet traffic lay severed on the ocean floor, cutting continents off from one another. Radio signals still flickered here and there, but without coordination or shared standards, they carried only fragments, voices calling into the void. By the beginning of the second week, it was clear that the waves hadn't just erased cities. They had dismantled civilization itself. The intricate global network that once connected humanity had disintegrated into spattered, isolated regions. Every community was now on its own, struggling to provide food, water, energy, and medicine without the infrastructure that had made modern life possible. In my facility, high in the Berkeley Hills, several hundred survivors had gathered, people who had reached safety before the waves came. We rationed what we had, scavenged what we could, and tried to make contact with other enclaves. But even optimism was fading. Every piece of data, every attempt to assess the wider situation pointed to a single truth. The destruction was too vast, too complete for recovery in any recognizable form. We were witnessing the end of the world as we had known it. The only question left was whether humanity itself would endure long enough to build something new. Months after the waves, rough estimates placed the dead at over 1 billion. The real numbers were unknowable. Entire countries were still underwater, others inaccessible, and disease and starvation were claiming more lives each day. The waves had killed hundreds of millions in moments, but the aftermath was killing millions more, slowly, relentlessly. The oceans themselves were forever changed. Sea levels had risen by nearly 20 meters, not from the temporary waves, but from the permanent collapse of the seafloor into the mantle. Ancient coastlines were gone. The new shorelines lay miles inland, rewriting the geography of the planet. Maps were useless now, artifacts of a world that no longer existed. Low-lying regions like the Netherlands, Bangladesh, and southern Florida were gone, drowned beneath new inland seas. Island nations such as the Maldives and the Marshall Islands had vanished entirely. Those few who survived became refugees in countries already struggling to feed their own.
Deeply calm, with a low, warm resonance. The flooding brought new crises. Salt water had invaded aquifers that once supplied fresh water to hundreds of millions. The contamination was so extreme that desalination plants, where they still functioned, couldn't purify it. The world's great river deltas, once the centers of agriculture, had become lifeless marshes. Crops that had fed billions would never grow there again. Even the climate began to shift. The rearranged seafloor altered ocean currents and wind patterns. The Gulf Stream, disrupted beyond repair, no longer carried warmth to northern Europe. The region was plunging into a deep freeze that scientists predicted could last for decades. In contrast, the tropics were heating beyond survivable levels as the ocean's heat exchange failed, creating zones where humidity and temperature made life impossible. With resources dwindling, the social fabric of humanity began to unravel. Cities that had taken in refugees were collapsing under the strain. Food riots, violence, and desperation became daily reality. Governments that had maintained order in the immediate aftermath were losing authority as their resources ran out. In many regions, power shifted to local militias and warlords who offered protection in exchange for obedience. In the United States, federal power reached only as far as the military could enforce it. The government, now based in Denver, continued to issue decrees, but its reach was shrinking. California, with remnants of agriculture in the Central Valley, had become effectively independent, trading food for fuel with neighboring regions. Texas, rich in oil but overwhelmed by refugees, sealed its borders and defended its own. International borders were meaningless. Mass migrations crossed continents in search of survival. Central American refugees pushed north as Americans fled south, colliding in desperate conflict zones that blurred the concept of nations altogether. Europe fractured the same way. Refugees from drowned countries like the Netherlands and Denmark poured into Germany, one of the few remaining centers of stability. Germany's government struggled to hold together a continent where central coordination no longer existed. The European Union had fallen with the destruction of Brussels. Every region acted alone, fighting to preserve whatever remained. Africa was starving. With ports destroyed and imports gone, millions were cut off from the fertilizers and machinery that had sustained industrial agriculture. Nations once devoted to cash crops were forced to relearn forgotten methods of subsistence farming, but generations of knowledge had been lost. Famine spread faster than aid could ever have arrived. Asia's suffering dwarfed all others. China had lost its industrial coastline and hundreds of millions of lives. The government had relocated inland, but its control was now symbolic. Real power lay with regional leaders and warlords who controlled food and water. India had fractured similarly, with each surviving province defending its resources against the rest. Technology, the hallmark of modern civilization, was vanishing. The world's factories, once clustered along coasts, lay beneath the sea. Electronics failed one by one as batteries died and power grids flickered out. With no manufacturing, no transport, and no materials, repair was impossible. Within a generation, functional computers and phones would be relics of a forgotten age. Medicine, too, was regressing. Knowledge endured, but without pharmaceuticals or sterile equipment, modern treatment was impossible. Hospitals that still operated relied on improvisation, tools repurposed, drugs diluted, surgeries performed without anesthesia. Infections that had once been trivial were now fatal. Nuclear contamination from destroyed reactors created vast exclusion zones. Japan had become uninhabitable, its soil and air saturated with radiation. California's once fertile Central Valley was slowly dying under invisible poison from Diablo Canyon's destruction. France's vineyards were gone.
the soil too radioactive to ever recover. At my facility, we had grown from a few hundred survivors to nearly 800. We talked, we farmed, we organized, but in truth, we were only delaying the inevitable. Supplies were dwindling, rainwater carried radioactive dust. Every decision, whether to drink, to plant, to stay, was a choice between bad and worse. Debate filled our nights. Would humanity adapt, or were we watching its final chapter unfold? The optimists clung to history's examples of endurance. The pessimists pointed to the scale of loss, industrial capacity gone, population decimated, and the environment itself poisoned. Science told us that the seafloor collapse was a geological rarity, a once-in-a-100-million-year event. But that knowledge brought no solace. It didn't matter how unlikely it was. It had already happened, and it had undone everything we had built. We had survived the flood, but survival and recovery were no longer the same thing. Children born into this new world would grow up among ruins, learning to farm and craft by hand instead of reading screens or flying across oceans. They would hear stories about skyscrapers, airplanes, and the internet, and they would think those stories were myths. The waves that struck on that quiet morning had lasted only hours, yet their legacy would shape the planet for millennia. Humanity had built its world on the illusion that nature was stable, that coastlines were permanent, and oceans predictable. When those assumptions failed, everything else fell with them. Now, as I record these final words, I watch the sunset over what was once San Francisco Bay. It is no longer a bay at all, but a vast inland sea stretching far beyond its old shores. The water glows orange beneath the fading light, serene, deceptive, as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath that calm surface lies the memory of a civilization that believed it could master the earth, until the earth reminded it who was truly in control.